This morning, we are continuing our series on God's economy. We're moving into part 3 of this series that touches on issues of what we might call the substance of our lives, issues about how we support ourselves and others, issues that really touch on the heart of our identities. Some of you have heard me say before that the decisions we make with our resources say so much about who we are and who we intend to be in the world. An example I often give is that my wife and I love to tell people, oh, we don't own a television. Now, we have our computers and we spend plenty of time, watching Netflix and things that are on the internet. But we like to look down our noses at people and say, oh, we don't own a television. That's an economic choice that we make, a financial choice that we make that talks about our identity, that says who we want to be in the world. And that is what's at the heart of these questions we're asking in this series about poverty, about faith, about inequity, about all of the subjects we're tackling. It's about who we are. It's about who we want to be and who we're called to be. In this series this morning, we are on the eve of Martin Luther King Day, and we're exploring the connection between race and faith and inequity. And we explore those connections through the lens of David and Goliath. As our reading begins, we are transported back to the time of ancient Israel, to an ancient battle where the Israelite and Philistine armies are arrayed against one another. The Philistines have sent a champion, the giant Goliath, to challenge one Israelite to one-on-one combat, with the winner of their fight being the winner of the war. Our reading is from the first book of Samuel, chapter 17, verses 26 through 37. Listen for the word of the Lord. David said to the soldiers who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." His eldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down here just to see the battle." David said, "What have I done now? It was only a question." He turned away from Eliab towards another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they were repeated before Saul the king, and Saul sent for David. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by its jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord, who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Holy wisdom, holy words. Thanks be to God. In Atlanta, Georgia, in a neighborhood called Capitol View, where you can't really see the state capitol building. The name was just a marketing ploy cooked up by a real estate developer decades ago. In Atlanta, Georgia, in a neighborhood called Capitol View, there are kids who quite literally have never seen the countryside, the forest, rolling hills and meadows, farmland. There are kids whose lives have been so circumscribed by their neighborhood, by their city, that they have never seen anything but the concrete urban landscape and the occasional park within its enclosure. Kids who grow up in Capital View see poverty, squalor, and struggle each day as they walk to the bus stop, each day as they go outside to play with friends. I know this because I used to live there. Toward the end of seminary and the beginning of my professional career in ministry, I lived in an intentional Christian community in Capital View. In that neighborhood, if you are an exceptional kid, you can make it out and lead a successful life. There are support systems there for those who would seek them out. There are good pastors struggling to serve a struggling community. There are neighborhood leaders trying to attract the kind of business investment that won't just raise all the real estate prices and drive all the struggling people out, but will actually build them up. There's a community garden. There's, at the local middle school, there's an after-school tutoring program staffed by the low-wage workers of AmeriCorps. If you are an exceptional kid, and if you are, you probably have exceptional parents. If you have exceptional parents who are leading you toward the right people and the right opportunities, who are providing a counter narrative to the one you hear from the men on the corner, from the kids in your school, from the general sense of despair and no way out and no life but this life that pervades Capital View, if you are an exceptional kid, you can make it out of all that and lead a successful life. But there are neighborhoods where you don't have to be exceptional to be successful, where the average kid has a pretty good chance of doing something positive with their lives and living well as an adult. In these neighborhoods, it's not a struggle to find good mentors and role models. They are abundant and everywhere. In these neighborhoods, most kids are instilled with the expectation that they will accomplish something in their lives. Rather than walking outside and meeting a pervasive sense of despair that is like a cloud over the community in which they live, they find hope. They find peace. They don't see dirt everywhere they look. They see clean streets and lawns that are well maintained. They don't see houses in disrepair. They don't see people with nowhere to go and no plans for the future. Or if they do, those people are the exception. In Capital View, the driven people are the exception. I imagine it would surprise no one if I say that Capital View is largely African American, that the few white residents there when I lived there were people like me, people who were called urban pioneers, who either hoped to make a difference in a struggling place or who hoped to make a profit from a neighborhood on the cusp of gentrification, on the cusp of losing its undesirable population and seeing the real estate values rise. And for that so-called undesirable population, what made them so? What led to this sense of despair? Where did this poverty come from? I see two potential answers to the question. One is to cite a lack of character, a lack of integrity, to say that the Black residents of this neighborhood and communities like it all around the US are simply not ambitious enough, not talented enough, that they are lacking in character. Another answer is to point to the systemic web of difficulties African Americans have faced and continue to face in our society. This web includes the legacy of past policies that created these neighborhoods in the first place, that kept African Americans out of places like Platte Woods or Parkville, or if they happened to be here already, as in the case of Parkville, they kept them distinct from the white population for as long as polite society would allow. In the David and Goliath story, a literal giant is challenging the soldiers of the Israelite army to one-on-one combat, with the winner of the battle winning the war for his people. In our reading this morning, the biblical hero David is a young boy who has been dispatched to the battlefield. His older brothers have been called up into service and are part of this army that is day by day cowering in fear as the giant issues his challenge. We can imagine these Israelite soldiers in their camp hearing Goliath call to them and mock them and laugh at them. We can imagine the Israelite soldiers looking around at one another as if to say, well, why not you? Why not you? Not me, not me. Why don't you take him on? The king has offered a reward for the person who answers the call. That is what the young boy David means when he asks, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?" What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? David is saying when he asks this question, remind me again of the award that our king has promised us. In this story, David is perhaps 12 years old. He is not old enough to be conscripted into the army. He's about 1 year short of that. Not old enough to be conscripted, but he is old enough to be sent to the front lines with provisions for his brothers. And he is old enough to watch the sheep entirely on his own. And when he gets to the front line, David is amazed at what he sees. How can soldiers from Israel, representing the one true God who created the world and rules over all, cower in fear like this? Don't they know that the person who faces this giant will have God at their side? Don't they know that armed with faith, they need little else to win the day? The civil rights movement of the 1960s was a David and Goliath kind of struggle. You know, a fact I recently learned, according to longtime residents of the Northland, there was a time when Black people were not allowed to be out at night north of the river. That if they were found in the wrong place at the wrong time, they would be arrested. Now, by definition, if you have a police force to enforce your preferences, you are on the side of Goliath. There was a time within the lifetime of many of us gathered here today that Platte Woods was marketed as an exclusive community. And exclusive meant that Black people were not allowed. That was within the lifetime of many of us here. Parkville was the exception that proved the rule in the Northland. An exception because there was a Black community here from the days of slavery and post-slavery. But even here, there were still segregated schools within the lifetimes of many of us here. Even here, there was a convenient hill on Main Street to act as a physical signifier of where the white population and Black population were generally supposed to be. Even at Parkville Presbyterian Church, where we had at least one Black member in the 1870s, a member who, this happened in the heady days after the Civil War. And that African-American man who became a member at the insistence of Colonel Park, who was himself a noted abolitionist. He insisted that this man who was a friend become a member of the church he founded. This was in the 1870s. But even here, it eventually became clear that this church was not going to be a church home for the newly freed slaves. And they needed to form their own congregations, which they did on the other side of the hill. Now, I say all this not to impugn the people of the past, but to own every part of our history and its legacy. The people who excluded African Americans from the life of our church back then were simply doing what most churches around the country were doing. They were simply following the conventional wisdom. They were being polite, respectable people. They didn't dislike African Americans, and you'd almost never hear them say a word against the Black community. But there was a time and place for them. You didn't go to church with them. You didn't have dinner with them. It's just the way things were. Too often in this developing story, people who looked like me were on the side of Goliath. When soldiers returned to the United States after World War II, soldiers who were white and African American and Native American and Hispanic and Asian, they benefited from the Montgomery GI Bill. They had access to money for college, to get an education and move toward a lucrative career. They had access to money for homes, to build up wealth for their families that could be passed on to the next generation. In many ways, the economic prosperity of the last several decades came through the Montgomery GI Bill, through its radical expansion of education and home ownership, both of which contributed to the building up of wealth in our society. But in the 1940s and 1950s, those benefits were unevenly distributed. Black people generally couldn't buy nice homes in the suburbs that would appreciate in value. They were excluded from those exclusive communities and redlined into urban areas. Black people generally couldn't get jobs in unionized industrial factories because union leaders and company leaders preferred people who looked like them. And Black people were often denied access to the kind of educational opportunities that would prepare them for college because other schools were separate and unequal. So in the wake of World War II, an economic expansion that boosted the whole US economy happened and saw its benefits go mostly to white families who generally passed those benefits down to people like me. And so people like me are left with a legacy of benefits created by a system that we didn't create, and of struggling neighborhoods where access to opportunity has been limited and only the exceptional can break free of the bonds that exist around them. And we didn't create those either, but they're there. Native Americans, Hispanics, and Asians all have their place in this story as well. Their American stories are rich and nuanced, and we wouldn't do them justice if we tried to tackle their narratives in this limited time. Instead, on the eve of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we think of African Americans who generally endure a wide income gap and an even wider wealth gap with white Americans. And yes, it's true that the white experience is not a monolithic one, that some families struggle greatly, especially in rural and Appalachian communities, but not exclusively there. It's just that there are trends to consider. There are wider realities at play beyond our individual stories. The white experience is not always one of wealth, but more often than not, it is an experience of good, healthy community, of a place where success is expected and nurtured, of a place where possibilities are not as limited as they are in other places. And in a similar way, the Black experience is not always one of struggle, but too many Black people too often grow up in struggling neighborhoods like Capitol View. And what those neighborhoods need are resources. Those neighborhoods need resources from people who look like me, people who have benefited from our family's historic ability to build wealth and to generate resources. Those neighborhoods need time. That's a resource. They need time from people like me who will act as tutors and mentors and role models. They need experiences. Experiences are a resource. They need experiences that draw them out of their neighborhoods and those narratives of despair and show them a new set of possibilities. They need investment from people who will invest in a way that doesn't drive out the current residents of the neighborhood, but instead builds them up. They need faith. They need people who will look at the immense challenge ahead of them and instead of looking around the camp saying, well, why not you? Why not you? Not me. Not me. You take on this struggle. Instead of saying that, they need people like David who will say, with God at our side, how can we lose? Of course we can take on this fight. We are equipped with a sling and a few stones, if nothing else. We are faithful with conviction that God will move us forward and support us and win in the end, if nothing else. There is still a David and Goliath struggle going on today. And the call of Scripture is to be on the side of David.